Good morning. This is the Blaine's World podcast that can be heard each week on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can also get more information and listen to previous shows at our website, www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And to that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Baker, a friend of mine, who's also a substance abuse counselor, naturopathic physician. He's going to be talking about the subject of addiction. But before we begin, Jeff, let me have you wave to all your friends and friends who are watching this.
Yeah.
So, okay, that is Jeff Baker. Jeff has kind of an interesting background. He's son of a bricklayer, the grandson of a coal miner. Have you ever done either of those two things?
Oh, bricklaying, more than I would like to do.
Okay. He's
In
been
fact,
a healthcare.
I came from a bricklaying job to your podcast.
Okay, in his spare time. He's been a healthcare professional for over 20 years. He's a doctor of naturopathic medicine, an educator, writer, lecturer. He's a certified alcohol and drug counselor here in North Carolina. As you just heard, he's also in his spare time, he does bricklaying. And Jeff, I have to ask you too, in addition to all that, are you still doing music at all?
You know, I've been picking the guitar up and doing scales. And the reason I do that is because if you don't play, your fingers kind of go haywire. So no and yes, is that?
Okay, well, that's a good answer, but I can only say, I hope you get back into music because I loved you as a musician.
Well, COVID didn't help, you know.
Okay, but in the next life, you'll also be a musician. But let me ask you this question, Jeff. So you grew up where?
I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia.
Okay, and when you were growing up as a kid in Virginia, did you always know you wanted to be an addiction specialist?
I can say no. No, I
No.
didn't.
What did you want to be as a kid?
I wanted to be a rock star. Didn't everybody?
Well, you were on your way for a while, right?
I knew very quickly I wasn't going to be a rock star. So I guess sports, early on, sports was a big thing. That was something that started with my father's desire to be a big sports player. So he lived through me a little bit. But that came to an end quickly too. I realized I wasn't a good enough athlete and I wasn't a good enough guitar player to make a living at it. So.
Okay, and I guess you were an okay bricklayer, but aside from being a bricklayer, what got you into the addiction field?
All right, so, well, I mean, I have a strong family history of addiction, so it's personal to me as well. And I think that's true for a lot of people in the healthy professions, whichever one you choose. Commonly, they'll choose something that's meaningful to them, right? That they have some either personal history or family history, somebody close to them. See that with people who go into oncology, they had somebody, their mother or father died of cancer and they want to cure cancer, etc. Well, my family, was unfortunately hit with the addiction bug, I guess. And so that was always in the background for me. And I realized early on in college that I liked psychology. So I ended up majoring in psychology, but it was just because I didn't, hey, I like doing this. Let's just go ahead and study psychology. So I studied psychology. I got out of college with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and it's hard to do anything with a bachelor's degree in psychology. So I wound up in Oregon, where there is a naturopathic medical school. The psychiatrist where I worked at an inpatient clinic, mental health. He recommended that I talk to some naturopathic doctors there in town. And so I did, and I ended up going to the naturopathic medical school here in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. To tell you that story is that was my foray into healthcare. I had some history of being in primary care, and then worked for several clinics, and then the laboratory here in town in Asheville, Genova Diagnostics. I worked for them for 7 years, and I realized that I did not want to continue doing that. And I needed to find what really really drove me, what I had passion for. And a friend of mine was program director of what they call an OTP, an opioid treatment program. And he said, hey, come on board. So I started working for him, and that was 9 years ago. I told him I'd work for 3 months, and that was 9 years ago.
Well, Jeff, let me back you up a little bit. First of all, you mentioned a term that some folks might not be familiar with. You said naturopathic.
Right.
That's your specialty. What exactly is that?
So naturopathic medicine is, first of all, it's a 4-year degree. You do required to have pre-med classes before you enter the program. Then you go through 2 years of the basic sciences and 2 years of both. I guess a short way of describing it would be integrated medicine. So we focus on, first of all, understanding diagnoses, how to diagnose a condition. What are the standard treatments, the medical treatments, allopathic, if you will, treatments for different conditions, but also to understand what may be the underlying causes as best we can in terms of how body systems work, how health is maintained, how disease forms out of the inability to maintain that health, and what we can do to change that dynamic. So that's naturopathic medicine in, I don't know, 10 or so sentences.
That's good, but take it a little bit further then. So how does addiction tie into it then? In other words, I should ask you a question, which I think I know, but a lot of folks may not know. When you're even talking about addiction, is that, how do you describe it? Is that an illness? Is that a sickness? What is it exactly addiction?
That's a good question. So there's a push now to call it a disease. And I think in a lot of ways that is an accurate categorization. The reason I think it can fit into that category is because it is really a relapsing, remitting condition. Cure is very difficult. It's something you manage over a lifetime, and we can talk more about that. Addiction is something that is caused by, nobody exactly knows, but there's some good theories on the causes of addiction and what the setting is inside of a person that then the environment could flip them into an addictive state, and then they live the rest of their lives that way.
Teach me this, Jeff, if you would. When you're talking about addiction or addictive state, I guess there are different kinds of addictions. In other words, whereas the personality the same in all the forms of addiction?
Another great question, Wayne. So there's a Dr. Anna Lemke. She's a Stanford psychiatrist, and she specializes in addiction and actually is chief of their clinic at their medical school that focuses on addiction. And she talks about how, well, she talks about it from a sense of pain versus pleasure. And this dynamic gets upset. There's neurochemistry that is managing pain versus pleasure. And of course, we all experience pain and pleasure, right? So from that basic premise, then you could say, well, anything could lead to an addiction, right? If you have an imbalance in managing pain and pleasure, in other words, if you're experiencing pain and you want to take that away by inducing pleasure, taking a drug, for instance, then you're shifting that balance artificially, and that's going to change your chemistry. It's going to change the baseline for what they call homeostasis, right? I mean, we've all heard of it. And anything could do that. So we see, obviously, I work in a place where we're dealing with opiate addiction, but we know that certainly the bigger, the drugs, cocaine, and now methamphetamine is unfortunately a very common addiction. But I mean, let's take the obvious, like alcohol. I mean, that's those are all working on the same pathways in the brain. We're still talking about that imbalance of pain and pleasure, and which sets up a dynamic of the addictive behaviors that we see. And you can stretch that into workaholism. You can stretch that into, you know, anyone. So I'm trying to think of like normal, quote unquote, normal behaviors that, when unbridled or imbalanced, are problematic. And you know, you could be a bowling man, right?
When you work with folks, are the principles the same in terms of their addiction, or do different people, if they're have a drug addiction versus smoking addiction versus alcohol addiction, is working with them kind of all the same thing?
It is. And when you have one addiction, it carves the pathway. It lays down the grounds for future addictions much more easily. Right? So you're addicted to one thing, then we call it cross addiction. You know, it's common for people who are trying to quit smoking or quit drinking, or, you know, some of the addictions that are less dramatic, let's say. There's plenty of drama there, when I said it that way. Just more common than opiate addiction.
Back to your background, you were talking about, you came from background of addiction. I come from somewhat of a background of addiction. What do you think drives somebody into that state of addiction?
Well, that's a complicated topic.
Right.
And so where should I start? I'll start with, there's some basics.
Right.
Have you heard of the rat park experiments?
Okay.
Rat park experiment was a psychologist saw the studies with rats where they had an isolated rat, and they had a water bottle, a cocaine bottle, where they could either drink the water or drink the water that's got cocaine in it. And of course, once they drank the cocaine, they drank the cocaine until they died. It was near 100% overdose in those studies, in all the animals that they studied. When the psychologist saw that study, he said, wait a minute, let's change the setting. So instead of having a single rat that was isolated in a cage, they had a rat that was with other rats, their brothers and sisters, and there were nice food around, and there were things to play with, and they can talk with each other the way the rats do. And they also had the water bottle, and they had the bottle that had the water and cocaine. Well, they tried them both, and some of them used the cocaine water more than once, but there was virtually no overdose. So you went from nearly 100% overdose in the isolated rat cage to no overdose in the rat park cage, where they had connection. And so connection then became a central feature in understanding what addiction was. And that then has forayed into a lot of the neurobiology that's been studied, et cetera.
So talk a little bit about that. Then the point is that, I guess, try to find out why they're addicted, if you can find out, but take that a step further. So then where do you go with that information? So you meet somebody for the first time and you work with them on a one-on-one. Most of your work is one-on-one, or do you do group work also?
I do groups, but not since COVID. But so I have people that I work with one-on-one.
And by the way, I should ask you, I'm just curious, since you mentioned it, if you have a choice to work with somebody who has an addictive personality or an addiction, is it easier for you as the person working with them to work on a one-on-one basis or a group basis? Do you have a preference?
They're both so different, and they're both groups are very effective because you're including people. I mean, they're helping each other. I mean, this is the whole thing about connection and not feeling alone, not feeling isolated, not feeling like there's something wrong with you. You're different than everybody else. That's a big deal. I think everybody can relate to that on some level, feeling like somehow they're an outcast, somehow there's something wrong with them, somehow they don't quite fit in. And that leads to neuroses, and that neuroses then can, manifest in a lot of different ways. And addiction is one way.
So describe the process, if you would, then, Jeff, if somebody contacts you, and I guess I should ask you that also, in terms of finding out about you, is that typically a referral, or what percentage of people come to you on their own versus kind of being forced to come to you?
Oh, the vast majority are voluntary. But I say voluntary in scare quotes because in opiate addiction, after a very short period of time, the main purpose of finding drugs is to not be sick. The withdrawal symptoms of opiate addiction is terrible. So I say voluntary, meaning they're not being made to come there. They just don't want to be sick anymore. And so that's where most people end up treatment center like that.
So how do they find you, by the way? So somebody has an addictive personality, either you or another specialist. How do you go about finding help?
Well, usually they'll either they have a family member or a friend that knows about opioid treatment programs. Methadone is the primary one that most people have heard of. There are other medications, but that's what people, I think most people have heard of. It's hard for me to know anymore. I've been in it so long, but people who are on the streets or they're dealing with the addiction, trying to find pills, which you can't find anymore. Basically, they're trying to find fentanyl on the street, which seems to be the most common one now. And they can't afford it or they can't find it, and they're sick half the time, and they're spending all their money, and they've sold all their possessions, and it's like, okay, I just got to go to a methadone clinic. I'm just gonna, I give up. I'm going, and so they end up coming to a treatment center like the one I work. That's primarily. Some of them come because they want to. Their lawyers told them they have some, pending court appearance, and they want to show the judge they've been doing something to try to change their lives. Some people, their PO tells them they need to go to a treatment center. So, but those are few and far between. I would say 5%, if that.
Talk about how effective it is, Jeff. So somebody, I guess, either recognizes they have a problem, or they're told they have a problem, or other people tell them they have a problem, and they work with a Jeff Baker. What are the chances of it being successful? And talk also about how many times it takes, because again, first time I ever learned that, I was surprised. I thought, make an appointment, I'll be better the next day. Not me personally, but other people. But it's not quite that simple. Is that correct?
That's right. It's not, and it depends on what success means. Methadone clinics were created, opioid treatment programs were created as a function of what's called harm reduction. Harm reduction, and this is the reason why it was created by the federal government. It's sponsored and monitored by the federal government and state governments. And the reason is because they just realized that the number of deaths, both in terms of overdose, but also in terms of people who do bad things because they're sick and because their mind is not well, meaning they've harmed others. The level of unwanted pregnancies, the amount of people going to prison, the disease rate, hepatitis, and heart disease is really common with addiction. All of that was such a public health issue that they decided, they being the government, decided to create opioid treatment programs where people could come and they could receive medication that they took on a daily basis that would keep them from getting sick. And that would, and this is the goal of what we do, is to try to find first a medication type and then a dose of that medication that makes them feel as normal as possible. And so then they can go and live their lives. They get a job, they're family that, they're able to be the parent that they want to be, they're able to have fun, and connect with those that they love. So harm reduction is really the initial goal, which is the first kind of measure of success. The next success would be, can a person get off of methadone now? Because a lot of people, one of the strong criticisms about methadone and buprenorphine and Suboxone, all these medications that are used in opioid treatment programs, is that you're just exchanging one for the other. Well, it's not that at all. I mean, we know that pharmacologically, we know that behaviorally, it's not. And the statistics are, hell, I guess the government now has nearly 50 years of statistics that back this up, just in terms of just plain numbers, right? How many people die? How many people go to prison? Those are very simple, measurements that you can then use to judge whether something is being successful or not.
So to get onto methadone, you were starting to say then, how often do they then, or what's the success rate of that versus getting on? Do some people stay on it the rest of their lives, I guess? And again, as you pointed out, that might be a success also. They haven't harmed themselves, they haven't killed themselves, they haven't done anything bad. But what percentage of folks who go on methadone get off methadone and then go to a non-addictive life?
It's really hard to tell. And so, okay, let me change your question just a little bit.
Sure.
How many people have you seen leave your clinic and get off methadone, right? How many people have come down on their dose, wean off essentially, and leave the clinic? I would say less than 10%. Less than 10%. And how many people then the follow-up question would be, okay, well, how many people do you talk to a year later? And I would say I've talked to one person a year later. I just haven't talked, either the numbers have changed or they're not, they've moved on in their life, or they've relapsed, or they're in a different clinic, or something, they have their own lives. So they don't follow up with me. I don't hear from them. I've called a few of them, and I've talked to one of them. And I was just mentioning this to another patient, because he was asking me the same thing. Because he wants to get off methadone. He's like, how many people have you seen get off? How many people are successful doing that? I was like, dude, I'm really sorry. I haven't seen that much. I haven't seen many people get off. So on that measure, I would have to say, I don't want to say it's not successful. That's not the outcome that I see.
Well, again, but it sounds, based on what you're telling me, it does sound successful though, because again, they're living and they haven't killed themselves. And I love that point you said about doing harm. So if we can prevent somebody from doing harm, that's a lot better than the alternative.
Yeah, and live a good life. Let's not. I mean, it is a good life. I have to say, it's like I can feel it now. I mean, to watch somebody change their life and to watch them kind of chokes me up, experience, happiness and reconnection and success in their life in terms of, what just the small goals. We think of, we think those of us not in, the throes of opiate addiction think of success as making more money and getting a better job, or I don't know, writing a book or whatever, these big goals. And the goals that, they feel in their heart is, and just feel so proud of, is, finally getting a job that pays them more than minimum wage, and being able to be with their children and see them go to high school and graduate, be a part of that. I mean, like those simple things are not simple. They're like, I don't know, they're what? It's the poetry of life. It's what's beautiful about it all. And so I see that. And I'm talking about everybody who's talking about the people who are on methadone and who've been on methadone for years, right? Maybe even decades. There's one patient that I work with who's been on methadone over 40 years. He went to the first methadone clinic in Asheville, which was just below the hospital here. So anyway, long answer.
Well, so the people then, I guess one of the things you work with, Jeff, is part of this, as you described, it's kind of a goal setting thing. Do you, when somebody comes in to see you, is that one of the things you ask them about what it is that they're trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So first question I ask, why are you here? It's right on our intake form. Yeah. Why are you here?
Do some people have trouble answering that?
Well, sometimes they're taken aback. It's like, I don't want to be sick anymore. And in fact, some people are just blatantly honest. That's why they're there. They're here. They're not really, most I would say even, are not here. They're not going to an opioid treatment program to get counseling. They're going to an opioid treatment program to get to not be sick.
Well, it's funny you said that because it takes back to what you said earlier, but this whole, I didn't realize it until you said it, this whole idea of pain versus pleasure. So I didn't realize that, I guess you see movies or the thought is that addicts are, taking this up and they all of a sudden have this high and they're happy, but you're telling me that's not the case, that a lot of people who are, not a lot, probably most people who are addicts, they're actually in pain as a result of being an addict?
Absolutely. Well, so what happens is that, I mean, just a little of the neurobiology, very basic, rudimentary understanding that I have about it is that you're shifting, meaning the threshold of pain, the threshold has come down. It takes less painful stimuli to feel more intense pain, right? And so, and it takes more on the pleasure side, which is dopamine. It's hard to visualize without a graph, but dopamine is what's managing this system. And essentially what happens is you become become more and more tolerant of dopamine. You're going to need more dopamine to satisfy that reward system. And you're going to feel more and more pain when you don't have that rewarding stimuli. And you're going to constantly seek it out because you need more and more of it. It's a vicious cycle that happens biologically.
So talk about, Jeff, the fact that aside from the individual wanting help, that it must be tough also, and you lived through it, the family, having to deal with this as well, loved ones, significant others, spouses, whatever. If you see somebody going through addiction, what should you do?
Talk to them. Try to reach out and connect. The thing I wouldn't do is lecture. And shame is it is a horrible reality. We all have experienced shame, and shame does play a role in our psychology. I'd say guilt is probably more important for sure than shame. But reaching somebody and talking to somebody and asking how they're doing, and, connecting is being there, just even being there. I think that's the first part. And then if they open up and they do want some form of help, then if it's opiate addiction, then absolutely look at programs and see whether or not a treatment program would be something they would be interested in, and maybe help them find one of those, because they're all over the place. I mean, unless you go to Tennessee. In Tennessee, that's a problem up there. It's the reason a lot of patients that come into North Carolina coming from Tennessee, because it has been a long, hard battle to get Tennessee to recognize methadone as a into a program if they're
What,
willing.
what if the person's not receptive to getting into a program?
I'm sorry?
If the person is not receptive to getting into a program,
If
how
a
do you
per-
deal?
So then you're dealing with taking care of yourself. And um, this is, what Al-Anon is built on. I mean, if you're in a relationship with somebody, whether it be a friend, whether it be a sibling or a child, whatever the close relationship is, and they are resistant to getting help, well, there's really nothing you can do about that. And taking care of yourself at that point is the most important thing.
You mentioned support groups. How valuable are they both for the relatives of the individual, but also the individual himself or herself? Are they valuable?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Not valuable, but I mean, are they not valuable? More, are they effective?
Support groups?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the most famous are 12 steps. Are you referring to that?
Right. Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been some debate about that too, which I really don't know that much about, but I can just say that doesn't, offhand, I need to have that discussion with somebody how 12-step is not effective. But I know that there's people who say that. That's not my experience at all. And I have, professional experience and personal experience with that. Like I said, my whole family is riddled with addiction, and Al-Anon has been very important to me, which is me recognizing how addiction has played a role in my development as an adult. So, I mean, I personally go to meetings, and I go to meetings, and it is something that I think is incredibly valuable. That people are have similar enough experience where you can relate, and you're again communing and connecting, and you're not alone anymore, and you realize that things can get better.
Also, you know this stat better than I do, but after somebody commits to a program and gets in a program working with you or whomever they work with, it sometimes takes more than one attempt. Is that correct? It just doesn't happen the very first time. And I guess some people want it to happen the first time. How many times does it take for it to click?
So, can I ask you a question? So,
Go ahead. Whose show is this? This is a Jeff Baker show. It's Jeff Baker podcast. Okay.
tell me what do you mean in terms of clicking? Okay, well, okay, go ahead. So, in terms of opioid treatment, or
More in terms of Jeff, I've heard this, and I went through this with a family member as well, that he had to go through the program and different programs at least, I think, 5 or 6 times. And to his credit, he's off it, he's doing great, but it didn't, the very first time he got into a program, everybody's excited. They thought he'd come out after 3 weeks or whatever, be perfectly normal. And he kept having relapses. And I guess that's a fairly common thing that happens.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean that is like that is not a like so MAT is another abbreviation that I should bring up. So MAT stands for medication assisted therapy. And opioid treatment programs are using, like I said, methadone, Suboxone, etc. Other treatment programs are you go in there and it's abstinence based. I mean, you're not taking any medication. You're essentially going to meetings and you're talking with the therapist, and you're in a community of people, inpatient usually, and you're away from your environment, so you're not using your drug of choice, and then you're usually discharged within a few weeks to a month or something like that. That has a very low rate of success in terms of just using that as a therapy to get clean, get into recovery, to be abstinent for the rest of your life. It's very low success rate. There are, residence-based where you actually live there over a long period of time. And that actually has a better success rate where you're, let's say, in a community for 6 months and nobody, it's an abstinence-based recovery where everybody is abstinent and then you have meetings and groups and therapy. So that's the next level, I would say. And then there's medication-assisted therapy. I like to say when we bring up medication-assisted therapy, it's like people on first pass say they don't quite get it, or you're just exchanging one thing for another. Like, okay, you're taking methadone, which is an opiate, and you have an opiate addiction. That doesn't seem like it follows. Doesn't seem like that makes sense. And I said, well, okay, well, so how would you classify taking an antidepressant? How would you classify taking a benzodiazepine like a Xanax or Klonopin? It's exactly the same thing. It's not exactly the same thing, but it is on par, right? I mean, you're talking about you're taking a chemical to change your neurobiology to deal with your mental health condition. And I would say your addiction is definitely a mental health condition.
How about the possibility, you kind of alluded to it when you talk about some of the treatment centers? How successful is it to then just go cold turkey? Say somebody, stop it and forget all this medication, forget seeing Jeff Baker, just, like there was a whole Bob Newhart thing about stop it,
Yeah.
the routine
Oh,
is,
yeah,
it's one of my favorites, just stop it.
too. Stop it.
Yeah, that's all you have to do. Is that possible?
I think some people do. Again, it's all conjecture. I don't know. I know my father said that he quit smoking cigarettes right before I was born, and he never smoked again. I said, "What did you do there? How'd you do that?" "Oh, I just put him down." Okay. So just putting down the heroin, I don't know if that works as easily. But some people do it. I mean, I've definitely heard the stories, but I've never seen it firsthand.
Your father's story reminds me, by the way, of a buddy of mine, sort of similar thing. He
Uh-huh.
wanted to quit smoking, and so he went to a hypnotist, and he said the hypnotist didn't help him, but he was damned if he's going to pay $300 again to quit smoking, so he stopped for that reason. But I guess that's the exception. Or I guess I should ask this too. Certain addictions are tougher for people to deal with than others. Like, for example, even food or smoking is, I guess maybe I'm answering my own question. I guess if you eat, you can still live. I guess if you smoke, you maybe still live. But if you're into heroin, you could die somewhere along the line. Is that makes it more significant addiction, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting though. Eating addiction. I mean, it is a very lethal and very, very difficult addiction.
Right.
I don't think people are fully aware of, unless certainly people who have, a food addiction know all about it. I mean, it's a really difficult addiction, and it's lethal. I mean,
Can be, yeah,
Karen
sure.
Carpenter, if you remember Karen Carpenter, she died an anorexic. She just starved herself to death. So anyway, that a little bit
Talk about
about
working with Jeff Baker. If somebody's interested in, I guess, working with you or speaking to you, I guess that would be the first step. And so let me ask you, if somebody wanted to reach you as a result of the show, or just talk to you about addiction, some of the things that are open to them, how would they get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, I guess email.
Okay. Are you willing to share your email?
Sure. It's I'll say it and spell it. It's a little goofy. HazelRodsky@gmail.com. So Hazel, Hazel, Rod, R-D, Ski or Sky, SKY. HazelRodsky @gmail.com.
Yeah, I always wondered, you don't have to tell me, but I always wondered what was the origin of that.
What's that all about, right?
Yeah.
Well, my dog, yeah. So my favorite aunt, she was daughter of a coal miner, was named Hazel. She was great. And so I named my dog after Hazel. So my dog's name was Hazel, and I called her Hazel Rod. And then a good friend of mine was, his name was Ski. He was Polish. And so I made my dog Polish. Hazel
Hold on a second. I love it. I lost you a second.
Okay.
There we go. Sorry. Hazel Rodsky. I love it. So now I know the origin of the name. So Jeff Baker, I guess in summary, I guess the key thing one takeaway I'm getting from this, that if you have an addiction, either you have it or you know somebody who has it, the takeaway is they should get help as soon as possible. The sooner the better. You know.
Connection. Talk. Be there. Don't judge. Take care of yourself.
Okay. Good advice. Anyway, Jeff, I'd like to thank you for being my guest this edition of the Blaine's World podcast. Also, to remind our listeners that you can find us on all the things we talked about earlier, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Really cool. You can find us all there, blainesworld.net. I'd also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tizzetti. Hope to see you in the near future via this podcast. But Jeff Baker, you and I will have to get together again. It's been too long, my friend.
Yes, I agree, Blaine. Great to see you.
Okay, thanks, man. Speak to you. Let me see if I don't cut you off.